The conclusion of the Chinese Civil War in 1949 saw Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communists triumphant on the mainland, while the Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang, led by Chiang Kai-shek, was forced to withdraw to the island of Taiwan. This has remained the de facto situation to this day, with both the People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the Republic of China, ROC, claiming to be the rightful sole leaders of China. By extension, despite the Civil War ending in 1949, the political and military struggle between the two Chinas never really ended. The ROC held the international high ground, so to speak, as it remained the more globally recognized China, even holding China's permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council with its crucial veto. The PRC, on the other hand, was only recognized as the China by the communist states of the world. So this left the two sides facing off against each other, literally, across the strategically vital Taiwan Straits. I'm your host David, and this week we are going to be looking at the two separate crises which occurred in the 1950s between the two Chinas, the aptly named First and Second Taiwan Straits Crisis. This is the Cold War. We talk about spies and espionage activities all the time on this channel. In the modern world, it's all about information security and stable access, and the sponsor of this video, NordVPN, is all about that. This multiple award-winning, including Best VPN Service of 2020, has more than 5,000 super-fast servers in 60 countries, which means that you have numerous options to choose from, and it even works in China. NordVPN doesn't log your data and protects you while you're traveling with its double data encryption technology. It's also super customer friendly with 24/7 customer support, a 30-day money-back guarantee, and it supports 6 simultaneous connections with unlimited bandwidth working on all your devices, no matter if it uses Windows, macOS, Linux, iOS, or even Android. NordVPN offers our viewers a special cyber deal. Every purchase of a 2-year plan will get you an additional 4 months for free. Save 68% and get NordVPN for 2 years for just $3.71 a month. Go to nordvpn.com, The Cold War, or use our coupon, The Cold War, at checkout. The establishment of the People's Republic of China was not necessarily seen as a total victory for Mao and the Communists, as the KMT had set up shop in Taiwan. As such, Mao wanted to take steps to defeat Chiang Kai-shek once and for all. Chiang Kai-shek, for his part, still felt that they could return to the mainland and, with help from the United States, remove the communists from power and resume control. Harry Truman, however, was reluctant to involve the US. To begin with, it appeared that Mao had already won. No need to involve the US in a lost cause. This was coupled with the American administration's displeasure at the corruption and overall poor governance of the KMT. All of this went so far as the issuing of a statement in January of 1950 that the United States would refrain from intervening in the event of further conflict between Beijing and Taipei. This was largely in line with American policy in Asia, which was not seen as a tremendous priority. This all changed, of course, with the outbreak of the Korean War. Suddenly, the specter of Asian communism loomed large in the minds of America, and the strategic importance of Taiwan became apparent. It provided a shield for US bases in both Japan and the Philippines, and should the island be taken over by the communists, would leave those bases exposed. In June of 1950, Truman ordered the United States 7th Fleet, only recently rehomed from Qingdao in China to Subic Bay in the Philippines, to enter the Taiwan Strait to ward off any military attempts by the People's Republic to attack Taiwan. As a byproduct of this, the United States, even under a reluctant Harry Truman, began to increase its support for Chiang Kai-shek. Loans and grants were arranged, as well as assistance in the reorganization of the military and implementation of government reforms. 1953 saw a dramatic increase in the amount of American support for the Republic of China with the election of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike was not a fan of Truman's more neutral stance towards Taiwan, and instead began a policy dubbed the, quote, unleashing of Chiang Kai-shek, end quote. Recently disclosed documents show that the Eisenhower government was far more enthusiastic about its support for the ROC and provided large amounts of both military and financial aid to help strengthen their military. The financial supports given were estimated at about $527 million, and military aid worth $940 million. Part of this support included the strengthening of defenses on ROC-controlled islands, including the Penghu Islands in the middle of the Taiwan Strait, as well as Kinmen and Matsu Islands, which sit just off the southeast coast of the mainland next to the present-day city of Xiamen. Chiang Kai-shek was looking for his opportunity to invade the mainland and was attempting to convince the United States that through a combination of further training for KMT forces, as well as the deployment of US troops, this could be done successfully. He was convinced that the Communist Chinese main ally, the Soviet Union, would refrain from involving itself directly. He was convinced of this from the Soviet track record of non-involvement. This was also happening at a time when there was quite a fluid power situation in Moscow, as Stalin had died and one single clear leader had yet to emerge. So by August of 1954, the ROC had stationed a large number of its own troops on the islands of Matsu and Kinmen. As they were doing this, the establishment of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, was being finalized. This was a collective defensive agreement formed by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, New Zealand, Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. SEATO's mission was to counter the further expansion of communism in the region, and naturally, the People's Republic of China was rather put out by this. 5 days before the treaty was set to be signed, the PRC began a heavy bombardment of Matsu and Kinmen, marking the start of what has become known as the First Taiwan Straits Crisis. The goal was to bring Taiwan under the control of Beijing, ending the threat posed by the ROC before a SEATO complement could be created, the proposed Northeast Asian Treaty Organization, or NATO, which would potentially be composed of the United States, Japan, South Korea, and the ROC. The Americans were caught off guard by the PRC's attack on the offshore islands, but still refrained from intervention. Their pledge to protect Taiwan extended to attacks on the island of Taiwan itself, as well as the Penghu Islands, but not the offshore islands. The US doubted the strategic importance of these islands and feared the possibility of triggering a war with the PRC's main ally, the Soviet Union. A few months later, in November 1954, the PRC began a bombardment of Dachin Island, part of the Taizhou Islands, to the north of Taiwan and just offshore from the city of Taizhou. This bombardment triggered the United States and the ROC to begin working on a new mutual defense deal. However, there was some disagreement on the scope of what would be covered. Chiang Kai-shek wanted American protection over all ROC territory, including the offshore islands, while the United States only wanted to extend that protection to Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, still seeing the offshore islands as a liability, likely to drag the US into a war it didn't want. Chiang Kai-shek, fearing the loss of the islands would not only harm the morale of the National Revolutionary Army of the ROC, but create a new PRC base from which to attack Taiwan, so he stood firm in his desires. On December 1st, 1954, Washington and Taipei concluded a joint statement regarding the signing of a treaty of mutual defense. The Americans affirmed their commitment to protect Taiwan and the Penghu Islands, while also noting that their scope of protection could be applied to other islands based on mutual agreement of the two parties. This gave the ROC some degree of protection, while also giving the US an avenue to not participate if it felt the strategic situation to be unfavorable. As you might expect, the PRC was quite unhappy with this new commitment on the part of the United States, and in response, escalated the bombardment of the offshore islands. In early 1955, an assault was launched against Yijiang Island, just north of the Taizhou Islands, as well as an escalated bombardment of the islands of Kinmen and Matsu. The US response to this was the Formosa Resolution, passed through the US Senate and signed into law on January 29, 1955. The Formosa Resolution allowed the US president, quote, to employ the armed forces of the United States as he deems necessary for the specific purpose of securing and protecting Formosa and the Pescadores against armed attack." End quote. Implied in this is, of course, that the armed attack would be from the communists. And, as if that wasn't enough, the Eisenhower administration also threatened the use of nuclear weapons against the PRC if their attacks were further escalated. In fact, as early as September of 1954, a nuclear attack was being recommended to the president's office by the US Joint Chiefs of Staff. I guess you don't need to be General Douglas MacArthur to threaten to use nuclear weapons against China. At the urging of America's NATO partners, nuclear weapons obviously weren't used, but this was largely because it was felt that their use would spark a war with the Soviet Union. Fortunately for those of us who don't want to live in the Fallout universe, the situation across the Taiwan Strait began to de-escalate. With Yi Jiang now under the control of the PRC, Beijing next turned its attention to Dachin Island. While Taipei wanted to save the island, the US remained skeptical of its strategic importance and strongly advised Chiang Kai-shek to leave the island and focus their defenses on other areas. This was a difficult choice for Chiang to make, as it actually reversed the Americans' prior advice, which was to fortify and garrison the island. Although he feared the impact that giving up the islands would have on the morale of the military, he feared the loss of American support even more, and the island was evacuated. Not long after this, the premier of the PRC, Zhu Enlai, issued a statement that the PRC would be willing to bring Taiwan back under the control of Beijing by peaceful means, and not just by means of military conquest. In mid-April of 1955, at the Bandung Conference, the first large-scale conference of African and Asian nations, Zhao also called for a ceasefire. At further talks between the two Chinas, the US insisted on a PRC pledge to no longer use force against Taiwan, a pledge the PRC was unwilling to make. This unwillingness stemmed from the PRC view that the situation with Taiwan was an internal matter, not recognizing Taiwan as an independent nation. Beijing saw this as a foreign power meddling in its affairs, something the Chinese were too familiar with from their recent history. At these same talks, the US made itself willing to officially recognize both Chinas, a recognition that neither of the Chinas wanted. So, although a ceasefire was established and the imminent crisis subsided, the core reasons for the situation still remained in place. As a side note, it was at this point, in response to American discussions of using nuclear weapons, that the PRC began its own nuclear weapons program. So, all's well that ends well, right? Wrong. With no resolution to the core problem in place, the relative peace between the two Chinas lasted for a few years, but it was only a matter of time before fighting once again flared up. It took until August 23, 1958 to be specific. The PRC, still looking to reclaim Taiwan, began a bombardment of Matsu and Kinmen Islands. This was done without the approval of Moscow, not surprising given the growing chasm between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. On the 24th and the 25th of August, PRC troops attempted landings on Dongding Island, a tiny rock about 25 kilometers south of Kinmen. This was being done in an effort to cut off supply routes between Taiwan and the island territories. The PRC forces, however, were intercepted by ROC naval forces, and the attack was repelled. Now, recall that mutual defense treaty that had been signed in 1954 between the ROC and the United States? Well, Taipei called on Washington for assistance based on its terms. The US responded not only by moving reinforcements for the US 7th Fleet into the region, but also by deploying both artillery and air units. The additional support was enough to bolster ROC forces on Kinmen and Matsu, and the PRC attacks were repelled. The additional naval support of the 7th Fleet kept the vital supply routes open, and the Second Taiwan Straits crisis settled into a stalemate. The Soviet Union, for its part, openly stated that it had nothing to do with the PRC attack and would not involve itself in the fighting. In fact, the Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko traveled to Beijing to urge Chinese caution and to seek a resolution to the conflict. Peng Dehuai, the PRC Minister of Defense, offered a ceasefire on October 6, 1958. This was the end of the second crisis. So, what did this series of events mean in the bigger picture? Well, first of all, it demonstrated that the United States was willing to risk a wider conflict in order to protect its allies. This was important, obviously, for the ROC, but sent a strong message to other US allies around the world. Another huge impact from the Taiwan Straits crisis was the start of the Chinese nuclear program. The Chinese concluded they needed to be a nuclear power in order to be taken more seriously by other world powers, specifically the United States. The second crisis also showed the advanced stages of the sino-soviet split. Beijing had risked a war without any prior consultation to Moscow, creating the final road to the fundamental split in the communist world. And as for the security of Taiwan, well, that would have remained precarious until the 1970s and the normalization of relations between the United States and the PRC. But that is another episode for another day. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode, and to make sure you don't miss all of our future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have bombarded the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com, and we're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, your financial support through www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership would be greatly appreciated. And just a quick reminder that we have merchandise available through Teespring at teespring.com/stores/thecoldwar. This is the Cold War channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.